St. Thomas Aquinas, in a very important chapter of his major work, the Summa Theologiae, I say chapter, so to speak, as you probably know, the Summa Theologiae as a scholastic work, scholastic from a certain period of late Middle Age, is divided into questions. Questions are divided in turn into articles. So in a sense, the questions are chapters according to our usual way to approach books, and articles would be paragraphs inside the chapters. And it's a very rational, logical distinction in Aquinas, because each article approaches a very specific issue, and then it goes in details through the objections and the answers of these objections. And so in this chapter, what I call chapter, is one question of the second part of the Summa Theologiae by Aquinas, and is question 18. And is second part is not still accurate, because the second part is divided in turn into two parts. And so we are in the first part of the second part of the Summa Theologiae, and in the question 18. And in this important chapter, Aquinas addresses specifically the question of what makes human actions good or evil. In Latin, the bonitate et malitia humanorum actum. So about the goodness and malice of human acts. And as you probably remember, in this chapter he goes through a very traditional doctrine in Christian, in Catholic tradition of thought, which is the doctrine about three main sources of the morality of human actions: the object, the end, and the circumstances. In the doctrine of the Catholic Church, they are usually called the sources of morality, meaning that when we look at our actions, these are the three elements we should look at, from which the morality of what we do comes. And it's a common sense distinction. I mean, it's very easy to approach it at first glance. If you think of an action, for example, stealing, I mean, this is what you do, materially speaking. I mean, you are stealing, and this would be the object, what you actually do. But then, of course, you can make it better or worse according to the end, what your intention is. For example, you might be stealing because you want to give alms to somebody else. So you are like Robin Hood. You steal from the rich to give to the poor. And this intention, this end, might make your action a little bit better. But then you can also steal a lot or very little. You are maybe a kid in a supermarket and you steal a candy. So stealing a candy is not like stealing a bunch of diamonds. So the amount as a circumstance can change a lot in the action you do. So in this distinction, of course, I mean, we have one key element, which is the object, which defines what we actually do, and other two elements, the end and the circumstances, that make the action better or worse. And this is pretty much the way in which Aquinas explains at the beginning of question 18 the distinction of the actions. And let's get more in details on his approach right now. So at the beginning, the main way in which Aquinas approaches this subject is according to the analogy with natural things. So he uses the distinction between substance and accidents, which is a very important metaphysical distinction. Basically, it indicates in classical metaphysics, starting with Aristotle, the ways in which things exist. And they exist mostly in two ways, basically in two ways. One way is according to the substance, according to what they are, and in another way according to something that affects the substance, but is not something in and of itself. So technically the substance is what exists by itself, what has its own act of existence. For example, the substance would be me as a human being. But then the accidents are affecting my being, but they exist only in me. They don't have an independent existence. For example, my being here in Italy or in the US, or my being yesterday or today according to time, or might be bigger or smaller according to how much I ate, or younger or older, taller or shorter. All these things, according to quantity or qualities, they affect who I am, but the substance is the substance of a human being. So when Aquinas approaches the human action, first of all, he considers the human action as a substance, as a being, as an object of study. And the analogy, he says, is exactly this. I mean, we should look at the action as we look at natural things, according to their substance and accidents. According to this analogy, the human action has a substance, which is given by the object, and has accidents, which are given by the end and the circumstances. And this is the way in which the question 18 begins. And the very first article, Article 1, raises the question of evil in general, according to the way in which evil exists in nature, in the world. And evil, of course, as you remember, in Christian philosophy and theology, is not considered as a positive reality. Evil doesn't exist as such. There is no evil per se, essentially, in the world. Evil is a privation of good. For example, being blind is not something that exists in itself, it's the privation of sight. I don't have something I should have according to my substance, and that makes me, that is an evil that exists in me. So even devil is not the existence of evil, is a bad angel. So somehow the existence of everything is good. Even the devil, as the existence of the devil as an existence is good. God created everything, and everything was good, including the angels. But then the devil decided to go against God, and under this respect is his evil, but his existence as a being is not evil. So nothing that exists is evil as such. And so Aquinas, from this viewpoint, explains that when we look at the human action, somehow the action is something good, insofar as it is something that exists. In a sense, this is the first way in which we can define goodness in the human action, as we do in every other substance. So there is something ontologically, to use a more technical term, good in everything that exists, including in the action seen as a substance. And then, what is evil in the action comes from some kind of privation. And Aquinas says, and this is the way in which the question 18 proceeds from Article 1 to Article 4, says that this privation can happen according to the main element of the action, which is the object, which is the one on which the morality of the action depends primarily. And then it can come from some kind of lack in according to the end, or according to the other circumstances. So in Article 1, this is the main statement. Every act, insofar as it lacks something of the fullness of the being a human action ought to have, it lacks goodness, and to this extent is called evil. And this is the main point. Fullness of being relates to the notion of goodness of everything, and this works also in the case of the human action. Now, Article 2 approaches the object, and I need to go back to Article 2 eventually, because after things get a little bit more complicated in this class. At the beginning, all I need to say at this very moment is that the object is the substance of the action, and it is the source, is the primary source, or it's being good or evil. And so from this viewpoint it indicates the nature probably of the action, because the substance is what indicates the nature of something. For example, my being a human being involves a definition, a proper definition of my essence. A human being is a rational animal, is an animal that moves according to reason, right? So this is my specific nature. So the substance involves also a predication in terms of essential nature, and also in terms of species, because the specific difference of what I am is what defines my substance. So you can say that the object is at the same time the substance, the species, and the form. Because in classical metaphysics, form and matter is very important terminological tool, conceptual tool. It comes originally from the physical, from the explanation of the physical world. It's the so-called hylomorphism. It means that in every existing physical being there is a composition of matter and form. So matter is what things are made of, and the form is what makes something what it is. And this distinction can be understood more easily if we think of things that change in nature. For example, a tree becoming ashes and whatever kind of gas realities, after burning, or becoming, a piece of table or something like that. I mean, when you see something in nature that changes substantially, you would say that the matter somehow remains, but what it is, the form of what it is, changed. So we have the form indicates what something is, but then the matter is what it is about, and the matter can be the matter of something else. So this predication. But the important logical distinction here is that the predication according to matter and form is used analogically for everything, even non-physical things, and this is just a logical predication. So Aquinas would say that in everything that is composed of more things, one of the elements gives the essence, gives the definition, says what it is, and this would be called form, and the other element would be the matter, is what it is made of somehow. So in this, according to this distinction, the object would also be the form of the human action. So it's the substance, the species, and the form indicates the nature. Then we have the circumstance. In Article 3, Aquinas wonders, because this is the approach, right? We have a substance, and we focus on what can create a lack of goodness in this substance. So he wonders how the circumstances can affect, if they can affect the goodness of the substance of the human action. And even according to a comparison with natural things, it says, of course, accidents can change the way in which something is lacking what it should have. In natural things, the full perfection a thing should have does not come from the substantial form alone, which makes it be the kind of thing it is. For a good deal is added by the ensuing accidents. For example, shape, color, and things of this kind add a good deal to man, and if any of these is not in due proportion, an evil results. So, for example, my being too thin might create problem to me, so it might be a lack of health too. So Aquinas, according to this, would say that the same goes with actions. The lack of some due circumstances of the action can create an element of evil, of lack of goodness. And remember, this is important. Evil is never a positive reality, it's a lack of something that the action should have. We'll see later what this means exactly, but for the time being, all we need to focus on is that Aquinas is saying that yes, there is a major evil that can come from a lack in the object of the action, and some evil can come also from the circumstances of the action seen as accidents, right? I mean, this is what we're talking about right now. Article 3 and 4 of question 18 about the circumstances and the end, again, are about the accidents of the action. And Article 4 is about the end, and it is a little bit more complicated. It's more metaphysical. To be honest, it's not clear, it's not immediately evident what Aquinas is thinking of in this article. The objections are kind of easy according to a general approach to the human action. For example, he wonders, of course, it seems that good and evil in human acts do not come from the end, right? And this is the first objection. Goes like this. Dionysius says, nothing acts with evil in view. Consequently, if action were good or evil from its end, no act would be evil, which is clearly false. This is a general, problem in morality. I never act according to something evil, because evil per se doesn't exist. So Aquinas would use the general, in the answer, the general explanation of the so-called apparent good. What is the apparent good? When I do something evil, I'm pursuing something which is good for me, but it's not good overall for myself. So, for example, when I forget that I'm married and I have kids, I might get excited about this lady I see around, and I stop thinking about everything else, and I just go with this lady, right? But then if I, make my vision broader, I see everything in my life. I see that this action is not fitting. So it's not like when I go with this lady, that's something evil per se. I mean, being together with the lady is not bad as such. But according to my life, my commitments, the other people around me, my previous commitments, a commitment in marriage, my duties, this would be evil. So apparently that seemed to be good in that very moment, but is an apparent good. According to reason, that's not good itself. Second objection, it considers end as an extrinsic cause. The goodness of an act is something that is in it. The end, however, is an extrinsic cause. Therefore, an act is not called good or evil according to the end. This is how the objection goes. And Aquinas replies saying, well, sure, somehow the end is external to the action as a substance, right? So, substance, accident. But he says the proportion to the end and the relation to the end are inherent to the action. So the action is related to the end. So according to this relationship between the substance and the end as an accident, it can be called evil. There can be something lacking in that relationship. The third objection says that a good act may be ordered to an evil end. This is much simpler as an objection, and conversely. So the objection says, since a good act can be ordered to an evil end, or the other way around, that means that the evil of the act cannot be changed by the end. So the end adds something, but doesn't change the nature. And of course, I mean, it begs the question, of course, this is the whole point Aquinas is trying to make, that there is an evil that comes from the object, and that remains according to the object, but then the end can add something to it, as every circumstance. So he says, nothing prevents an action from being good in one of the ways mentioned, and not in another. Thus it is possible that an action which is good according to its species, or the object, or according to circumstances, be ordered to a bad end, and vice versa. But an act is not good absolutely unless it is good in all ways, for evil results from any one defect, while good results from the whole cause. As Dionysius says, Dionysius is the author of the Divine Names, which is a very important work that Aquinas always refers to. And this saying that Aquinas is recalling, this saying from Dionysius, is very important. So it's a key principle in Christian morality, that good comes from the good of the whole thing. Everything should be perfect for having a good action, but the evil can come from the lack of every little element, whether the object or the circumstances of the end. Now, these are the objections, but the main body of this article, Aquinas' response, is a little bit more complicated. And it goes back to the very meaning of good and being in metaphysical, according to metaphysics. So, and we need to go back to this, and which is very important. It's a general premise of our understanding of human actions. And the premise is that good and being are the same thing. In metaphysics, good or truth or being are called transcendentals. What it means is that they don't refer to something different. So they refer exactly to the same thing. So good is being seen from a particular viewpoint, which is the relationship with the will tending to this, to the being. So, and the truth is the same thing, is the being in relation to our intellect knowing it. But it's the same thing that all these terms refer to. And the end embodies the ratio boni in Latin, the rationale of what good means, because good is what everything desires. This is the famous line at the beginning of Aristotle's Ethics that Aquinas always uses, is the good is what we tend towards. So, of course, the notion of the end is a constitutive of the notion of good, compared in the relationship between the being and the will. So, what Aquinas is wondering here is how can the end, as something that is not in the substance, the object of the action, is not the substance of a being, add something to its goodness. Think of it this way. Imagine to have a glass completely full of water, and you define the being of the glass as its good. How can how can you add something to this goodness? Because goodness is the being of everything. And it's interesting how Aquinas approaches this issue. He draws a difference between God and us and the other creatures, saying that there are things that depend on another, on something else, and beings that don't. God, who doesn't depend on anything, his being is everything, so there is nothing that can be added to it in terms of goodness. But in our case, it's like saying that we are incomplete. We are tending towards something that is supposed to complete what we are. So in this tension, in this relationship to something else, which is given by our ends, the end can give something to us in something more. He says, now, hence in the divine persons whose goodness does not depend on something else, there is no consideration of goodness on the part of the end. But human actions and other things whose goodness depends on something else derive goodness from the end on which they depend over and beyond, praeter, the absolute goodness which is in them. And here Aquinas closes this response, this very metaphysical approach to the question of how the end can add something as an accident to the good of the substance, recalling the four ways in which we can talk about goodness or malice in the human actions. Remember, the first one is ontological, is the action itself, and the others are the ones we just went through, the object, the circumstances, and the end. Hence, a fourfold goodness can be considered in human action. The first is the goodness an action has in terms of its genus, namely as an action, for it has as much of goodness as it has of action and being, as we have said. Second, an action has goodness according to its species, which it has from its appropriate object. Third, it has goodness from its circumstances, its accidents, as it were. Fourth, it has goodness from its end, which is related to it as a cause of its goodness, a final cause. And so now these four articles, in a sense, are I would say, the first part of this question 18. At the beginning, in these first 4 articles, Aquinas explains the elements that makes the action good or evil in this analogy between natural things as substances and their accidents. So the human action is a substance and does have accidents. And he goes through these elements just saying that they affect the way in which the substance, the human action, can be good or evil. It doesn't say anything specific about it. It's just saying that first of all, the object and also the end and the accidents can affect, in terms of lacking something from the fullness of being of the action, can affect its goodness and malice. But now, from Article 5 on, until the end of question 18, which is made of 11 articles, he starts a different approach to the human action, according to species and generic difference, genus and species. Because now he wonders exactly what is it that makes the action good or evil, essentially, because the specific difference creates an essential difference in things, right? My being a rational animal, my rationality creates a specific difference, defining exactly my essence. So what is it that makes X specifically good or evil? So Article 5, which is a general introduction of how human acts are specifically good or evil, somehow is a new beginning of question 18 after a first explanation according to the substance and the accidents of the human actions. And then Aquinas, at this point, from Article 5 on, goes again through the object, the end, and the circumstances, but this time from a different angle, from a different viewpoint, from the viewpoint of how these elements affect the species of the action, or the way in which they don't. And all they do is to act as accidents in terms of increasing or decreasing the goodness of the action. So there is actually there are several resemblances between Article 5 and Article 1, because they are both grounded on the same main metaphysical principles. The main one is that evil is not a positive reality, and so evil in human actions is a lack of order somehow. A lack of order in what sense? Compared to our reason, as we mentioned in the example I made just a few minutes ago, is the way in which I reason about my entire actions that can make them fitting or unfitting, suitable or unsuitable to my overall good as a human being. So the main point in this Article 5 is to clarify that human actions are called good or evil in relation to reason. Because, as Dionysius says, the good of man is to live according to reason, whereas evil is to live apart from reason. For the good of a thing is what is suitable to it according to its form, the evil that which is in opposition to the order of its form. And so this is the main difference in human actions, whether they are suitable or unsuitable to reason, whether they are fully in accordance to reason or they lack something in the order that reason should impress upon our actions. I'll go back to this point later in this class. But here I just want to mention, in terms of clarification, one example that Aquinas recalls both in Article 5 and here in Article 1 and here in Article 5, and he uses, interestingly enough, the same example to make pretty much the same point. So he uses the example of adultery, and he clarifies that the action involved in adultery is not evil per se. According to what it is, according to the potential it has as a human action, it is good. It's not evil. And what he's focusing on is the power of generation. So that kind of action is suitable to generate a new human being. From this viewpoint, the the conjugal act and the adulterous act, they belong to the same species, to the same essence, according to that power. That would be the first way in which human action can be called good, according to its ontology, according to what it is metaphysically. But then he says, according to reason, they differ in species. One is good and the other is evil, because the adulterous act doesn't fit the order of reason. And here it lacks something what it should have according to its complete order, which is what it is, but inside marriage. And again, if you look at these two articles, you will see that with the specific with the nuance that in the first article is just related to the fullness of being, and here is related to the order of reason, but is exactly the same point Aquinas is making. And then he stresses in several other ways that, again, I mean, the evil act has an object. So Aquinas would say there is an objection I just mentioned on passing, that is the second one, in which that goes like saying, but the non-being of the evil cannot create a specific difference. So because acts, if they are specifically essentially good or evil, how can something which is negative create a positive difference? And Aquinas, again, clarifies this. An act is said to be evil in species not because it has no object, but because it has an object which does not conform to reason. So again, the point is positive reality and lack of order of evil. And now, the way in which question 18 goes on is with two very important articles, 6 and 7, in which Aquinas wonders whether the specific difference, the species of the act, is given by the end or by the object. And the answer is somehow both. And so Article 7 wonders which one is more specific, which one wins the prize at the end. I'll go back to these articles later, because there are some complications related to Article 2 and then Article 6 and 7, which I need to relate after some more clarifications we need in this class. Then he wonders whether there are actions which are indifferent specifically. And this is interesting. He says, yes, I mean, according to the order of reason, according to my plan, my end as a human being and what I should do, there are actions which by themselves are indifferent, like taking a walk. So these actions can be done whether in a good way or in a bad way. Now, what he adds in Article 9 is that actions, yes, they can be specifically indifferent, but when you compare these actions to the individual who is acting, they cannot be indifferent, because my action is always part of a choice, which is an overall choice. So he would say that every human act proceeding from deliberate reason considered as an individual action must be good or evil. He says, because there is always some circumstance, or at least the end, he says, that can affect it. Imagine that you are taking a walk, for example, in order to spy your neighbor, or you are taking a walk to make your grandchild happy. So at least the end is, or you are taking a walk in a very dangerous situation, so another circumstance can make the action not that good. So there is always something, at least in my end, in the end I'm pursuing, that can make the act good or evil. So compared to the individual who is acting, the action is never indifferent, even though the species can be as such indifferent. Now, but this indifference has to be considered compared to my reason. So if an action is not coming at all from my reasoning, he makes the example of scratching my face or moving a hand or a foot. This, unless I do them really on purpose, for example, I scratch my beard right now as a part of this class, to make an example, But if I just make them, says Aquinas, out of some kind of imagination, something that just is floating on my mind without focusing, this is not even a human or a moral action. So it's not a human action, it's not moral. So it is an action somehow, but it's not moral. In the last two articles, and I need to go back to them too a little bit later, Aquinas wonders whether how the circumstances can affect the species of the action. So the 10th is about this very issue, can the circumstance affect the species? And the 11th is if every circumstance affects the species. Now, the general answer is that generally speaking, circumstances don't affect the species, because remember, in the first part of question 18, we have this analysis according to substance and accidents. And accidents, by definition, don't affect the substance. So they increase or decrease something. But they don't change the species. This is the main presupposition of this analysis. So one of the reasons why we need to go back to some of these articles after some more clarifications is that there is an apparent contradiction here, because Aquinas is treating the end circumstances at the beginning just as accidents that by definition cannot affect the species. And then in the second part of question 18, he actually considers how they can affect the species. Affecting the species means changing the act from good to evil and vice versa. Not affecting the species means just to increase or decrease the goodness or malice. For example, I steal a lot or I steal a little, but I'm still stealing, right? So the action is the same. The circumstance doesn't change the action from evil to good, and vice versa. So, but in the second part, it seems like circumstances in the end affect the species. So the key question is, so are they still accidents or they are something different? And this needs a little bit more, digging that we need to do. Another factor that complicates the analysis, and it's actually a highly debated issue in Aquinas' theory of action, is that the object as the main element that determines the nature, the species, the substance of the human action is the form, as we said. The form is what indicates the definition, the specific difference, right? But when Aquinas usually talks about the object, he calls it in terms of matter, is what we materially do. So, and also when he compares it, as we are about to see, to the end, he calls it a matter compared to the end as the form. And so is the object something material or something formal in the action? This is the main question we need to address. And let's make it a little bit more complicated yet. Again, the main analysis here is about substance and accidents, right? But in another question in the first part of the second part, which is question 7, Aquinas talks directly about the circumstances of the human action. And of course, when we read just question 18, when we think of circumstances, we think of them as something different from the object and the end, right? Because we have three elements as the sources of the morality of the action: object, end, and circumstances. So we would expect to have, in the specific question devoted to the circumstances, to have just a clarification of the circumstances as the accidents of the human action. Actually, this is the general premise. Whatever conditions are outside the substance of an act and yet in some way affect the act are called circumstances. But that which is outside the substance of a thing and yet affects it is called an accident of it. Therefore, circumstances of human acts should be called their accidents. This is in the very first article of question 7. So here it's restated. Well, actually, it comes before question 18, so it's stated for the first time that by circumstances, we mean the accidents of the substance of the human action, right? But then again, when Aquinas starts talking more in detail about the circumstances, when he lists the circumstances, he seems to list pretty much everything. So he wonders in Article 3 of Question 7, in the third article of Question 7, whether the circumstances are correctly listed by Cicero and Aristotle, and they are who, what, where, by what aids, why, how, when. And he also clarifies that Aristotle adds a circumstance that Cicero didn't list, or at least that he included under the what, which is about what. In Latin, Aquinas says circa quid, which is very similar to the expression he uses for the object in Article 2 of Question 18, is circa quam. In other parts of the work he says also circa quod. So, technically in Latin, circa quid and circa quam, or circa quod, they don't belong to the same term. One is a pronoun and one is an adjective, a qui and quis, but the meaning is pretty much the same. So here, pretty much, Aquinas, when he talks about the circumstances of the action in general, he seems to include everything under the concept of circumstances, the object, the end, and the other circumstances. So, how is that possible? I mean, is there something really missing here? Or Aquinas just made a huge mistake in his work? And this is one of the main factors of complication that we need to address. Let me summarize them again. I mean, on the one hand, we have, from the beginning to the second part of the question 18, we have two different approaches. The first is the object is the substance, and the end and the circumstances are the accidents. By definition, the accidents don't change the substance of an action or the species of the action. In the second part, Aquinas wonders what affects specifically the action as good or evil, and he accepts the idea in ways that we need to explore better, that the end and the circumstances do affect the species of the action under certain respects. So are they still accidents or not? And the other problem is that the object somehow is considered a formal cause of the action as a substance, so what gives the species or the nature to the action, but sometimes is addressed to as a material thing of the action. So, and by definition, the matter is not the form is what impresses the nature of on the matter. And the other problem, which is connected, is that when Aquinas addresses in general the accidents, he seems to include everything under the notion of accidents / circumstances of the action, including the object and the end. Now, I think in order to solve these puzzles related to question 18, we need to go way back to the concept of voluntary action, what it is. And for a moment, I need to go really back to the first part of the Summa Theologiae. We need to be able, at least for a moment, to look at the whole thing from the above. I mean, to see in what world we are moving when we enter to question 18. In the first part of the Summa, Aquinas addresses the human being as a creature. Remember, it's a theological work, so it's structured according to God and creation and revelation. So, according to God's creatures, Aquinas explains the human being. So, in a sense, the treatise on human anthropology, on the philosophy of the human being, is in the beginning. In this first part, Aquinas explains our intellectual powers, the intellect and the will, but not entirely. He delays the explanation of the will under a very specific respect to the second part of the work, which is the one we are addressing today. Why? Because he says that the operations of the will, they belong to moral science. He actually used scientia in Latin, or and Aristotle used episteme, is the Greek term for science. So this is not the place to explain why science is a appropriate term for morality too. But in any case, Aquinas delays the explanation of the moral science later. Why? Because in the first parts he addresses the human being in a sense in a theoretical way. I'm using a distinction which is very important in Aquinas and is taken from Greek philosophy between theoretical and practical knowledge or science. So, and what it means is that theoretically, in a sense, we just receive data. We are indifferent to the knowledge, in a sense. So imagine that you're reading a detective story, and you learn how to perform the best possible theft or murder, whatever. But just learning about this, reading about this, doesn't make you a murderer or a thief. Why? Because you are receiving knowledge. You don't move towards that the object of your knowledge as something you desire, something you identify with. So, and this is something that the will does. If you think of the intellect and the will this way, it makes it very clear what the main difference is. It's all about our intellectual nature, but in one side of this intellectual nature, we just receive data. So we are still, and data are coming towards us, right? It's like putting data into a computer. But then we need to move towards something. When we move, something entirely different happens. We need an engine, making a dynamism inside that actually makes us move towards something. What can it be? It needs to be something that changes somehow what we know into what we desire, that makes it attractive to us. And what is this is what is traditionally called the appetite, which is the same thing with the animals. Animals, animals' nature too. So the appetite can be for something we just see or smell. The dog sees food and goes towards the food, right? First he sees it and then he moves towards it, right? So receiving and input and output, right? But in the case of the rational nature, what we move towards, what we desire, is the object given to our knowledge by the intellect, is an intellectual knowledge. So the will is the power making us move. And this is something that Aquinas learns from Aristotle, that the intellect by itself doesn't move anything. Knowledge doesn't move by itself, but knowledge mixed with desire, with the attraction, with the appetite, that it does have an intrinsic engine. So this engine is the will in action, is the will can create the action. So the whole point of the scientia moralis that Aquinas delays to the second part of the Summa Theologiae is to have this engine at the source of everything. And so it's the voluntary action. This is all about what makes our action voluntary. Because without this will involved into the operation, we cannot move towards something that we know intellectually, that our intellect knows. And so we have that the second part of the Summa, both the first part and the second part, which is about the virtues, the specific virtues, are all about the moral science in Aquinas, and they are all about the voluntary action. And the first part of the second part begins with the general question about the ultimate end, because without an ultimate end, there is no reason applicable to our moral actions. Imagine, the typical analogy with material things, that natural things that Aquinas likes very much. Think of, for example, the digestion process. In the digestion process, of course, without the ultimate end of the digestion, you cannot evaluate and understand each part of our digestive system, because they are understood in view of an end. If each of them, each of these parts had to be understood according to something more specific, they wouldn't be considered as part of the entire mechanism. So if there is no ultimate end, at the end of the day, there is no way to evaluate what we do as good or evil, because it has to be according to one only final measure somehow, a measuring system. So, and the ultimate end is a big part of the first part of Aquinas' moral treatise. And then he talks about the human action. Everything is about the human action. He talks about the human action in general, and the end of this discussion is question 18. And then, well, roughly the end. Then he keeps going with the morality of internal and external actions. Then he goes on with the interior or intrinsic principle and external principles of human actions, which include, law and grace and the devil and powers of the soul and especially the virtues, which are the main subject of the second part of the second part. So all is about the voluntary action and the meaning of what voluntary action means. And this is what we need to address before going back to question 18 and try to address the puzzles that we left unsolved so far.